Thanks a lot for taking the time to do this podcast, Matt. I know I've been interested in flow state for a while, for a couple of years now, actually, and always wanted to talk to someone who's an expert in this area. So really excited to chat
Well,
with you.
you might want to call someone else. I don't know if I'm an expert, but certainly like you, very interested in it,
Hmm.
and I do run a few workshops on it and stuff like that. But I don't run any of my own research or anything like that. It's
Yeah.
more of a passion and an interest, and I think learning how to help others apply it, help apply it to clients, whether they're athletes or executives or whatever, and kind of trying to tap
Hmm.
into flow a bit more is something I'm very much into.
Well, before we get into any of that, can you just give us like a general description of your work, the consultancy services you offer, your background?
Sure, sure. So my background is in sport and performance psychology. So I was lucky enough to attend the University of Denver and did a master's there. And it was really applied program. So we were working with clients, working with primarily athletes at the time, on building mental skills. Building
Hmm.
emotional skills, things like confidence and focus, and dealing with performance anxiety, mindfulness, and then the team dynamic stuff. So as I moved home from Denver, I began teaching at Humber College not long after. So I taught sports psychology there for 5 years, along with a few other courses, but mostly sports psychology. And throughout those 5 years, I was also coaching hockey, and I also had clients kind of on the side, maybe 2 to 4 clients at a time, typically athletes, typically teenagers, in the 10 to 20 age bracket, and typically on the elite path. So whether they're AAA hockey players or junior hockey
Hmm.
players, provincial level, national level athletes, collegiate athletes. So kind of dealing with athletes who their sport is a big part of their identity, and they want to pursue it kind of beyond just youth sport. So that was really fun and great. And then in 2019, in the spring of 2019, I decided to leave Humber and pursue coaching and consulting full time. So still working with athletes, definitely, but decided to branch off and pursue work with more corporate clients. So applying the same principles of high performance and performance psychology, but maybe instead of applying it to soccer, we apply it to sales, or working with financial analysts, working with managers, working with lawyers,
Hmm.
on all the same things, on confidence, on self doubt, on performance anxiety, maybe on a lot of mindfulness and meditation and things like that. And then on the organizational side of things, I work with leaders and coaches and managers on designing the optimal work environment for their employees. Or culture is a word that
Hmm.
gets thrown around a lot. So, we talk about things like effective communication and feedback. We talk about things like developing, trusting relationships and empathy and displaying vulnerability. Um, and having a sense of optimism and things like that around our work. So on an individual level, again, work with athletes and executives on building mental skills and helping them make sense of their experiences. And then on the organizational side of things, helping them kind of take a zoomed out look on how they can improve the process of the organization.
No, that's perfect because in sports, there's so many life lessons that we can take when it comes to like performance and pressure and even you know life is almost like playing a game. So
Mm-hmm.
it's yeah, there's a lot of relatable things that we can take from sports and apply it in life. And although this is like a sports science podcast, I always try to kind of draw some lessons as many as I can from sports and put it in like real life context so that everyone can use it, not just athletes or coaches or.
For sure. No, I totally agree. And even when the bulk of my applied work was exclusively with athletes, I would tell them or their parents or their coaches, like, if the only place you apply this stuff is on the soccer field or in the pool or on the ice or on the court, um, I'm only doing half my job. All
Mm-hmm.
of the skills you're learning as a 14-year-old elite soccer player, you can hope, the goal is you apply to, moving away to school one day. You apply to your first job interview, your first job, your first intimate relationship, or, developing kind of more, meaningful relationships in your life. communicating effectively, taking time for self-care, all those things. Yes, they're very important in sports, and they manifest themselves in sports quite readily. But as you mentioned, they're just as important, and maybe even more important in regular life.
So one of the areas that you work with your clients on, and whether they're athletes or they're in organizational settings, is flow state. And like I said earlier, this is something that I've been interested in for a couple of years now. The first time I heard about it was Faraz Zahabi. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him.
No, I'm not. Yeah.
He's George St. Pierre's coach,
Okay.
and been his coach his whole career, and one of the best coaches in MMA. And he brought it up once. I was listening to him on a podcast, and he brought it up, and he mentioned how getting into the flow state allows you to kind of be hyper productive, allows you to be in an optimal zone of focus, where it's not too challenging, it's not too boring, and how that
Hmm.
yields so many benefits. So could you describe to us what flow state is? I guess like just like a definition for people who may not be
Sure.
familiar with it.
Sure. So, flow state is an altered state of consciousness where we feel our best and we perform at our best. So, confidence is at an all-time high. Things seem to come easily. Our focus, as you mentioned, our focus and our ability to process information is like vastly amplified. We have no inner critic. We have no self-doubt. We have no self-consciousness almost. So we're not scared of what might happen. Fear of failure totally dissipates. Usually time is distorted somehow, so whether 2 hours goes by in 5 minutes, kind of the time flies when you're having fun type of thing. That's very common. Or on the other hand, 5 minutes might seem like 5 hours, just with the level of detail and the level of intensity that you're experiencing. That 5 minutes, it might seem longer.
Right.
And certainly athletes talk about the game happening in slow motion, and you're able to read things more readily. Sorry. um, that's kind of the definition that I go off of. Is it's just an altered state of consciousness. The slang term or slang phrase used a lot is getting in the zone.
Right.
So we've all had maybe experiences with that, whether it's in sports and music, just socializing with friends. There's any activity we can get into, get in the zone or get into the flow state. That's kind of what one phrase that gets thrown around a little bit.
Yeah. So being in the zone is equivalent of flow
Hmm.
state, or sometimes when we hear like with runners, I'm not a runner myself, so I wouldn't know. But when people say the experienced runner's high, where like like the perception of time is different. They feel no like exceptional like physical exertion. They're just in an optimal zone. Is that the same as flow state, but for runners?
I think so. I think runner's high, happens during and sometimes even after the run, where those, we're going to talk about some neuro activity that goes on during, or
Mm-hmm.
neural activity that goes on during flow. So there are some chemicals being released when we're in that state, some neurochemicals that can really help us feel that high. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So again, for runners, it's that runner's high. For musicians, it might be after a great jam session. For writers, it might be after a great writing session. You might have that sense of like, even when you're done the activity, you have that sense of heightened engagement and maybe heightened pleasure and everything. And then you'll come back down eventually. But no, I think runner's high would qualify for sure.
So okay, let's get into some of the like the neuromechanisms, or the neural underlying mechanisms of flow state. What happens in the brain during that state?
Sure. So a few things happen. One is that our prefrontal cortex, the activity in our prefrontal cortex really decreases. So our prefrontal cortex is the part of our brain kind of right behind our forehead. It's the most evolved part of our brain as humans. Our brains kind of evolved from the back forward. So it the function of the prefrontal cortex is kind of what separates us from a lot of other animals. It's responsible for self-awareness and self-consciousness. It's responsible for long-term planning and forecasting and judgment and rationale and things like that. So when that part of our brain, when we are in flow, that the activity in that part of our brain drastically decreases. So that inner critic, that self-evaluation, uh, totally disappears. When we're in the zone, we're not thinking, what do other people think of me right now? you
Mm-hmm.
know and when we are very self-conscious, maybe in front, public speaking in front of a crowd, or in a job interview, we're evaluating our previous answer while the interviewer is asking us the next question, type of thing. That's the part of our brain that maybe has that negative self-talk or that self-evaluation component. So that shuts down entirely. And the parts of our brain that are responsible for things like creativity and collaboration and problem solving and information processing are drastically amplified. So our brain kind of trades um, energy that's typically used for that long-term planning or that self-awareness for now information processing, and pattern recognition and attention to detail. So now any energy we were using for self-consciousness or self-awareness or long-term planning now is redirected to the part of our brain responsible for that information processing and awareness and external awareness and things like that. So that's really cool. There's also some emerging research that I think is really interesting. It's the research was done in religious settings. So long-term meditation, long-term prayer, kind of a spiritual setting. That they found our right parietal lobe, which is kind of in the middle of our head on the right side, the right parietal lobe. The activity in that area of our brain is also drastically decreased. So what the right parietal lobe is typically used for is understanding where our body is in space. So understanding that, where my hand ends and the external world starts. So it kind of prevents us from bonking our head on the ceiling or stubbing our toe. Or if I want to sit on this chair, my right parietal lobe kind of understands like where my body is in relation to the chair. So what this research found was the activity in that area really drastically decreases. And that's really cool because we might have heard people say, I felt one with the water, or I felt one with the music, or I felt one with my teammates. We were all on the same page, and they're not just saying that. Like, according to their brain, that's literally what's going on. They cannot tell the difference anymore between where they end and where the music or the water or the writing or whatever they're doing starts. So it's like that total loss of sense of self, which I think is really cool. And maybe that's where we in sports we hear terms like we're on the same page, chemistry, things like that, where the actual function of our brain, the right parietal lobe, that decreases. So I think that's really cool. I hope your listeners do too. So that's those are some things that happen kind of anatomically, and then chemically, a lot of neurochemicals get kind of flooded into our brain during the state. So first and foremost are norepinephrine, or adrenaline, and dopamine. So these are, again, attention sharpening chemicals. They're pleasure chemicals. So when we have flow and dopamine is released, we want to chase that feeling again. We want to
Hmm.
go towards it. Flow can be very addicting. And pain can be reduced. As you mentioned, maybe you're running a marathon, and typically you would feel pain. Now, because of that adrenaline, it's masked. That's one of the functions of adrenaline, masking pain. So there's different things going on neurochemically as well as neuroanatomically.
So, because when it comes to the reason I ask is because when it comes to flow, like you mentioned, we hear so many slang terms around it. Like, you're in the zone. It's an out of body experience. It's one with the water. There's a lot of those terms, and they're great. But when it comes to like scientifically deciding like the underpinnings of it,
Mm-hmm.
um, before I started prepping for the show and before I got to know your work, I always thought that they were mostly just things that are expressed verbally, but they're not actually proven anatomically or neurochemically. But it's very interesting to hear that these things actually have a neuroscientific basis to them as far as how they happen.
Yeah, there's lots of research around, brain scans and MRIs and things when people are in flow, and tracking the brain activity when those people are engaging in those activities. Is this stuff has empirical evidence based backing. which I think, it's definitely been going on for a decade or two or more, but I think we're still on, I say we, I'm not a researcher, but we, the population, are still on the cutting edge of it all, so it's really interesting stuff.
So we know what flow is now. We know what it means to be in the zone from an anatomical neurochemical perspective. How do we get into that state? Like, obviously we've all experienced it, I think, whether it's when we were playing a sport, whether when we were doing some work, studying for an exam or something. Maybe you took some Adderall and you were in the zone for 6 hours at overnight.
Yeah,
Not saying that was me, but maybe it was. um, how do we get into that state to begin with? What needs to be, what needs to go right as far as the environment, the task, the person?
sure. So there's a few necessary ingredients. The most important one is finding the right balance between our skill level and the challenge. And you alluded to that in the intro a little bit. So if we're taking on a challenge that far exceeds our skill level, it's going to be frustrating. We're going to become dejected. We're going to want to quit. We don't feel a sense of progress. It's not all that fun. On the other hand, if our skill level far exceeds the challenge that we're taking on, it's going to be too easy. It's not going to be challenging. And after a while, same thing. You're going to be disengaged. It's not all that fun. It's not that meaningful. There's no progress. So finding that right balance between things that are just hard enough, that kind of test your skill level, make you have to pay attention closely, pay attention to maybe mistakes you're making, correct them in the moment. That challenge skill balance is really the most important ingredient. So taking on hard things, taking on things that you struggle with just enough, right? Again, not so difficult that there's no point, but just enough that it's just outside your capabilities. And the phrase in the research used a lot is it's these activities are within reach but out of grasp. So you can just feel around the edges. You can just kind of like just get it, but it takes that focused, that effortful focus to engage in those activities and get better at them. Another thing would be clarity on a few things. So goal clarity, understanding what you're trying to do. It might sound obvious, but I think one of the most frustrating things for athletes or executives is a lack of clear expectations. How are you supposed to do a good job if you don't know what's expected of you, right? So having clarity around what you're trying to accomplish. And then along with that is clear feedback. And that feedback might show itself in a few different ways. It might be the activity itself is giving you feedback, whether what you're trying to do is working or not working. If you're trying to play an instrument and play a certain song, obviously you would hear it and you'd have to stop and, oh, that note wasn't right, I'm going to correct it, or what, that was played too fast, I'm going to try to correct it. Or that feedback might come from a coach or a manager kind of in the moment. So that clear and immediate feedback is also a really necessary ingredient to feel that sense of progress. Am I on the right path? Are things going well or not? Having that feedback is really really important. A next one is being present and being totally engaged in what you're doing and totally absorbed, not worrying about what's happened in the past or getting caught up on past mistakes, and not worrying about what might happen in the future. I tell clients all the time, the two biggest distractions we face for the most part are the past and the future. So if we can kind of drive our attention into the present moment, that's going to kind of grease the wheels a little bit to help us get into flow more often. And the last one is recovery. We talked about coming down from a runner's high. We can't just chase flow all the time. It can become addictive, but being hydrated, sleeping well, eating well, taking time for self-care, that is a very important aspect of flow and the ability to get into flow more often. If we're over fatigued or dehydrated or we're burnt out, the ability to be alert and that hyper awareness of information processing and all that stuff just won't come. So recovery is also a massive part of it.
So I'm not like, this is very interesting. I'm not a neuroscientist, but I do know quite a couple of things about like feedback and being on the right path. So I listened to Andrew Huberman on a few podcasts, and he mentioned that quite often. And that is like being on the right path, and getting the feedback that you are actually on the right path towards your goal. That releases dopamine,
Mhm.
releases the dopamine pathways in the brain, more so than achieving the task itself. Like just knowing that you are on the right path, and watching yourself make progress towards a goal is more rewarding than achieving the goal itself. And I guess that ties into flow, which I never thought about it until now, is that that's where dopamine comes in when it comes to flow, is like knowing you're on the right path. That's what releases the dopamine pathway.
For sure. And I think, as you mentioned, we all love to cross stuff off our to-do list,
Hmm.
and be productive. And that does release flow, or release dopamine, sorry. But as you mentioned, the progress towards the goal is often much more meaningful and much more like pleasurable
Hmm.
than achieving the goal itself in the end. Right.
Hmm.
So it's the journey, not the destination, and
Yeah.
progress over it, process and progress over outcome, and those things. Right.
Hmm. So when you let's dissect this a little bit when it comes to like making sure things are right in order to achieve flow. The task has to be just challenging enough to get you challenged,
Mhm.
but not too challenging to where it's too much for you. Also, not too easy to where you're bored and disengaged. How could we ensure that? Like it's I guess it doesn't happen that often for people, let's say in school or in a workplace, because you have to do the duties that are delegated to you. Sometimes they are way above your skill level. Sometimes they are way below. Can we do anything to kind of change that, and make the task itself a bit more, um, you know, conducive to flow?
Yeah, I think you're right. You mentioned maybe the tasks being given to you either at school or maybe in a job. Maybe they're too easy, or they're too difficult. They're not always of our choosing. So, adding your own spin to them, maybe trying to complete them in a certain amount of time, maybe trying to complete them in a new way, or using innovative methods or something like that could be one. But it's funny, another ingredient of flow that we haven't touched on yet is having this intrinsic purpose behind it, doing the activity for its own sake, not
Hmm.
doing the activity for an external reward, or avoiding an external punishment or something like that. So, yeah, just identifying, something with clients. We just identify risks they can take, identify challenges. What challenges are you going to take on today? Whether it's, I work with some sales reps, whether it's making more calls, whether it's getting over a certain type of objection, whether it's taking more time for self-care, whether it's listening more and using silence more. We can all identify things that we want to work on today. We talk about progress and specificity and stuff. Like, what challenges can you take on today that's going to stretch you, that you care about? If we don't care about them, then if we don't achieve them, it's like, oh well, maybe tomorrow. We want to have goals and challenges that are really intrinsically motivated and that are meaningful to us, and write them out. you know Make a certain amount of calls today, or design. Maybe you're a graphic designer, design five new products today, or finish a presentation, or maybe something you've been working on. Say, hey, call somebody up on a phone call or a Zoom and say, hey, can I have a half an hour? I'm going to go through this presentation, and I'd love your feedback on it. Asking for feedback and asking, being vulnerable is a challenge that people want to do. That's hard to do.
Hmm.
Asking for help. So that might be one thing as well.
So can we touch a little bit on goal setting when it comes to flow? You mentioned that as part of like the few requirements or, yeah, prerequisites for flow. Obviously, goal setting is huge in for athletes, but also for people in the workplace, for students. For how can we use goal setting to our advantage in order to get in the zone? When we plan ahead of
Yeah, I
time, or.
think I think that whatever your goals are, um, I think making them visible and making them tangible is always beneficial. So what I mean by that is, um, if you want to make 15 calls a day, like have 15 X's and cross them off, or something like that. And you can, we talked about the sense of progress. You can feel the progress as you get to the goal. A lot of times people just say, well, I want to maybe make a certain amount of money by this day, or I want to have a job by this day, or, the goals are very kind of like finite, and outcome-based goals, results-based goals. Have process-based goals, have progress-based goals. What are the baby steps I can take to get there? And then, color them in, cross them off, rip them off the paper, make them physically tangible and visible to us, and we can sense that, we can feel that sense of progress.
Mm-hmm.
So, we want to have a good balance: outcome goals, process goals, and something I call purpose goals. Understanding like, why are these goals important to us, can add some meaning to it as well. So a lot of times people are able to talk about what they want to achieve, and the process would be how they're going to do it, and then the purpose is, why is it important to you? And that can kind of open a door to some meaningful conversations as well.
It's true, because a lot of times we have, like I said, tasks that we want to complete, whether they're delegated to us or whether we want to do them. Let's say it's a school project or it's a thesis, and your end goal is get this chapter done, for example. Well, it's like, how can I? That's not a, it's an outcome, but what tangible guideline does that give you? Not much. Like, you got to break it down into smaller parts that are easily measurable, tangible, and that could get you on the right path towards achieving that ultimate outcome that you're striving for. And I think when we,
sorry, I was going to jump in and say
yeah.
The good thing about process goals, or kind of those smaller goals, is they I would recommend that they direct your behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Like making 10 sales by the end of the year doesn't really direct your behavior, but saying, making 50 phone calls a day, or running 10K a day if I'm training for a marathon, or, as you mentioned, writing one chapter a week or something, like, they should be behavior based.
Mm-hmm.
That's one way to make sure that we can, there's that clarity we talked about before, specificity we've touched on. That would be a recommendation as well.
Because if we're gonna have to agree that in order to get in the zone, the task can't be too challenging to where it's too frustrating for you, then there's no option but to break it down into smaller, tangible steps that you can take. Because if you just sit there and say the goal, the goal is to make this much money this year, it's like, that's the idea of that is just too frustrating, and provides no guideline to begin with in order for you to take some steps and get into the zone while you're taking those steps.
Sure.
Yeah. So how can a coach, I guess let's start with sports and maybe transition into workplaces. How can a coach provide an environment for their athlete that is conducive to flow?
So I was thinking about this question over the last few days as you passed them on beforehand. I would break it down into a few things. In practice, um, what I would recommend, depending on the resources you have and how many coaches are available and spacing and all that, but rotation-based drills, right? So instead of having 10, 15, 20 players, wait in line, go through the drill a few times, wait in line, go through the drill, wait in line. So you run a drill 10 times, or for 10 minutes, they might spend 3 minutes in the drill and 7 minutes waiting in line. That's not a very rich or deep learning experience. So again, depending on your resources, if you can assign one coach to 5 players and they work on this particular skill or this particular formation, or whatever the drill is, for 8 minutes, 10 minutes, and they'll get rep after rep after rep, it's a much richer, deeper opportunity for skill acquisition and learning than standing in line with 15 other kids. And the other bonus to that is, if the same coach is maybe running the station as the kids rotate, that coach can now give much more individualized feedback. We talked about clear feedback and immediate feedback. That coach can give that to maybe 4 or 5 players. It's a lot easier than 15 players, let's say, right? So it's a much more the relationship is much relationship ratio is much smaller from player to coach, and they're still able to get more reps, they're able to get more feedback, they're able to learn more in those stations than they would in other drills. The other thing about practice would be to make it hard. You know, a lot of parents and a lot of coaches, they want to design this perfect practice where the passes are accurate, the shots are accurate, everything looks great, no one's making a mistake, it looks like a well-oiled machine. The problem is nobody's learning, nobody's getting better. So you might think, someone watching that practice might be like, wow, this coach runs a great practice. Look, everyone's doing so well. It's going so perfect. No one's learning. The problem on the flip side of that is if you do make a practice or run drills that force kids to struggle a little bit, take them out of their comfort zone, it kind of looks like a train wreck sometimes. Kids might be losing the ball, falling over, turning the wrong way. So it doesn't look very good, but done properly, that's where the most learning happens. As we struggle, we learn. So we need that challenge for us to get into flow state, as we've talked about. So, breaking some drills down to make them a little bit harder, adding rules. You can't, you have to pass on your left foot, or you have to pass on your backhand, or you have to do 3 passes before you can shoot. So again, that will also drive their attention into the now. Like, they have to pay attention to what's going on and not be distracted about the past or the future. They have to be engaged in the drill right now to accomplish those rules before they can succeed. So I would recommend the station based if it's within your means and within your resources, and then making drills that are hard, making drills that force them to struggle, and redefining to them what struggle means. It means we're getting better. It means we're present. It doesn't mean that you're not good, or you're not good enough, or you don't belong here, or something like that. And then on game day, what I would recommend is in our pregame speech or in our coaching, a lot of coaches actually prime their athletes to be distracted. And what I mean by that is we direct and I've been guilty of it as a coach myself, we direct their attention to the consequences of the outcome rather than the task at hand. So we've all heard phrases like do or die, win or go home, now or never, or hey guys, like, this team's 1 point ahead of us. If we win, we'll be ahead of them. If we lose, we're out of the tournament. If we win, we'll qualify for nationals. That has nothing to do with their performance. That has to do with the consequences of the result. And, then I think a lot of coaches think that that's motivating. I think it's a lot more distracting than it is motivating. So instead of focusing on, what's my job when I'm the weak side winger in our defensive zone, as in a hockey example, what's my job when I'm a midfielder in soccer and the other team has the ball, in terms of maybe communicating with teammates, having your stick on the ice, transitioning well, the task-based jobs or the task-based goals that you want your players to follow through on, direct their attention there rather than what might happen when we win or lose. So that, again, instead of directing their attention to the future, we want them to be able to be present and be engaged and flow with the moment. That would be something I would recommend as well.
Because we are such a like an outcome focused society in general, and that's what we go to first is when we want to achieve something. Is like, okay, what's the outcome? Let's do it, rather than the process. And you're right. Sometimes, obviously, you got to have your eye on the target and the ultimate goal, but that in itself can be distracting to the process at hand and how you should go about it.
Yeah, it's really kind of, maybe it's a bit of a paradox, where things we really care about, are, winning, and maybe on a personal level, getting drafted, getting a scholarship, being noticed by scouts or getting opportunities, like impressing our coaches, impressing our, playing well and being a valuable member of the team. Every athlete cares about that stuff very deeply. But in the moment of performance, during the game, on the ice, on the field, on the court, in the pool, whatever it is that you're doing, those things that you care about are irrelevant to your decision making. So the fact that there's I might get drafted, or there's scouts in the stands, or if I win this race I'm going to qualify for nationals, that's not relevant for you to make great decisions in the field of play.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, we all have outcome goals, we're all motivated by them, that's all fine, but being present, focused, and focusing on the task at hand will ironically lead to you achieving those results more so than just focusing on those results all the time.
Right. So on the flip side of that, because I said, we're going to start with sports and transition into some real life examples. If we were to draw some lessons from that, how can a leader or a boss or manager facilitate that, environment that's conducive to flow for their staff?
Honestly, I think it's really similar, where I've had bosses, and I've been around organizations where there's that focus on the consequence of the outcome. If you don't make any sales, we're going to have a difficult conversation. If you do really well, you'll get a bonus,
Mm.
or um, we're constantly talking about results and constantly talking about what might happen if, rather than directing their attention to whatever their job is, being creative, tapping into their creativity, tapping into collaboration, focusing on the client and really understanding their needs, paying attention to them, focusing on body language, even like really specific details. Those are the things that's going to lead to your employee success, rather than trying to motivate them with ultimatums, rewards, punishments, threats.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, I understand every business needs to make money, and the bottom line is how the world goes around. I get that, but how we get there, I think, is flawed in a lot of organizations. So allowing them to just tap into their strengths, tap into their skills, um, instead of focusing on the outcome all the time, would be one. And again, similar to coaches with the drills and practice, give them hard tasks, like challenge, like preface it and say, hey, this is going to challenge you, I'm here to support you, I'm here to offer resources or insights or information or support, but this is going to be difficult for you, and there's a reason for that. We want you to grow, we want you to be out of your comfort zone. We support you here, but this is what we expect maybe moving forward. So give them maybe individual tasks, team tasks that are slightly out of their capabilities, just enough, right? That
Mm-hmm.
challenge skill balance we've talked about a few times.
Could mindfulness be helpful for getting into the zone, for getting into flow state? Is there any research on it, or from your experience, could that help?
I think so. I mean, I certainly think there are people in the world who have gotten in the zone or experienced flow who have no idea what mindfulness is and have never practiced it. So I don't know if it's a necessary component, so to speak. But I think, again, I was thinking about this with the questions you sent over. For those who practice mindfulness, mindfulness is the ability to be present without judgment. I think getting into flow is all about being present and being engaged in the present moment and information processing and that kind of thing. So those who practice mindfulness and who have some experience with it might be more skilled, I guess, in accessing the present moment, whatever flow activity they're pursuing. So the ability to be present has probably been improved if you are practicing mindfulness. Additionally, I think the ability to recognize when you're not present has also been improved if you practice mindfulness. So
Mm-hmm.
if you are playing soccer or at work or whatever it is that you're doing, and you find yourself being distracted, that self-awareness, say, oh, I'm thinking about dinner or a mistake I made last week or what I'm doing this weekend, let's drive it back down to the task at hand and be present. That recognition, that ability, I think, has also been improved. So I think practicing mindfulness would allow you to get into flow more often. But if you've never meditated or practiced mindfulness, I don't think it's a lost cause by any means.
I think something you just mentioned that's like so important is, from my experience, I found that what mindfulness has been so helpful with is not so much so the amount of time that I spend being present in the moment. It's it's actually just like the ability or the skill to realize when I'm not,
Mhm.
and like being able to kind of gently transition back into the present moment. That has been in itself just as helpful as making me spend more time being present.
For
So
sure.
I
Yeah,
can see how I can relate to flow and getting into the zone, is realizing like, oh shit, what am I thinking about right now? What am I doing? You know, I'm not being engaged. Let me get back to the task at hand.
exactly.
Yeah. Um, this is a question that's probably related to what we've been talking about, because obviously we've been hitting on a lot of things at the same time. But and it's fine if you maybe repeated what you said earlier, but what are some barriers to getting into in the zone? Like we talk about the things that need to go right, but what are the things that prevent us from getting into the zone?
Yeah, I think honestly, it's just a lack of a lot of the ingredients. So a lack of clarity, a lack of expectations, not knowing why you're doing what you're doing, or not knowing how this is going to work out for you, not being able to feel a sense of progress, you know, having that inner critic maybe in your ear, that negative self-doubt, or having, we talk about clear and immediate feedback, I guess, with the assumption that it's productive and respectful and, facilitative and those things, instructional. But if you do have maybe a very critical coach, or a critical parent, or a critical boss, that's, replacing your negative self-talk with their own criticisms, I think that would be a good way to kind of pull you out of flow and pull you out of the present moment. um, so I think it's just kind of a lack of those, those ingredients we talked about before. um, yeah, I guess that would be
Hmm.
my best answer.
So let's end the section on flow, because I want to get to talking about something else that you've been working on that's really cool. But this is the last question on flow. Um,
Sure.
what is like a misconception, or like a myth about flow or getting into the zone that you see as being common out there, but you know is not true?
Yeah, I think it's less so a misconception that in my applied work so far. It's not that people have the wrong idea about flow, or the wrong ideas about flow. It's more about the fact that they'll say things like, "Oh my God, I didn't even know this was a thing." I get in the zone when I play soccer, or when I'm in sales, or when I'm, with my kids, or whatever. I didn't know that people studied this. I didn't know that this was actually a research field, you know, and that people, that there's understanding how to get into it, and barriers, and ingredients, and things like that. So it's not so much a misconception per se. It's just like it's not something we learn in school. It's not something that's talked about quite a bit. So it's really cool for me to, talk about this stuff, and it just like it instantly clicks with people, because flow is universal. Any person, any culture all around the world can get into flow in different ways. So it's more so that than any misconception. I guess the one misconception maybe would be that you can just kind of chase and chase and chase it, and the recovery is not as important. We talked
Oh
about
yeah.
the neuroanatomy, and being
Hmm.
alert, and information processing, and things like that. So the, really deep recovery in terms of sleep, in terms of hydration, nutrition, self-care, maybe meditation, even relaxation, that is such a critical aspect that maybe does get forgotten a little bit.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's not surprising. It gets forgotten in almost any like high performance environment, whether it's sports or the workplace or something. I feel like rest is something that people always overlook. So it makes
For
sense.
sure.
That's also
For
in
sure.
flow state. So I mentioned something like a project that you've been working on. That's really cool, and you sent me some stuff on it, and I found it really exciting. So it's called athlete cognition, correct? Right.
Yeah.
Can you describe like what that is, and tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, so athlete cognition is an athlete's ability to perceive information in kind of the entire field of play. and make really effective decisions based on the information presented and kind of based on their own past experiences. And words like awareness, anticipation, hockey sense, basketball IQ, vision,
Mm-hmm.
words like that get thrown around when talking about really elite players. It's really their ability to read the environment that is constantly changing in a lot of sports, right? And assess what's going on, process the information, and then correctly anticipate what's next. So the analogy I use a lot is like, can I show you the first link in the chain and what the fifth one looks like based on your experience, based on, practicing with your team and maybe video and pre-scouts and what you've learned about the sport and things like that. Can you correctly anticipate what's going on based on what you're seeing now?
Mm-hmm. One thing you mentioned in that is like the deliberate vision of athletes. What does that mean?
So deliberate vision is, I mean, it's it's really the having intent and having purpose around like literally what you're looking for in the field of play. There's so much information that's available to us, and what truly separates elite athletes from average, even if skill level or physical skill level is the same, is the ability to again access that information, seek it, look for it literally, and then process it. So a great example here is in the book The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. It talks about Tony Dungy, the retired NFL coach who's a Super Bowl champion, and I think he's in the Hall of Fame, very successful coach. And he would instruct his linemen or his defensive team to look at the angle at which the opponent's offensive line, the angle of which their feet were pointed. And he would say, if it's angled this way, it's probably going to be a run play. If the angle of the toes is straight ahead, it's probably going to be a pass play. Or I might be mixing that up, but you get the idea. And so now the defensive players can deliberately look there with that cue that was given to them by their coach and say, oh, now I can kind of anticipate what's coming next. And it's kind of cool. Like, I think it's pretty cool. You start to respond to things that haven't even happened yet. And I think that's really cool, precognition and things like that, where let's say a defensive player reads it correctly, comes off the edge and sacks the quarterback. What do the commentators say? They say things like, oh, what a smart player. He was able to read the defense there. He anticipated things correctly. It doesn't really have that much to do with functional intelligence like we think about it. It's this athlete cognition, and being able to be coached appropriately, look for things deliberately, see them, process them, and then make correct decisions. So I think in sports like volleyball and soccer and tennis, a lot of elite athletes, like they look at the hips. They don't really look at the ball, but they look at the hips of their opponent, and that will dictate the trajectory and the target of the ball, right? So it's knowing what to look for and processing the right information is truly what separates elite and average athletes.
Yeah, picking up cues when it comes to like athletic performance, and it's not just a matter of picking up as many cues. It's not the quantity; it's the quality of cues that you're picking up, and how valid are they at predicting the next play. And I think that's when you hear about like I guess the slang term for it, when you hear about the great athletes, is they read the play well. They're one play ahead of everyone else.
They see the play before it happens.
They see the play before it happens, and that's, I guess, that would be the maybe you could call the psychological underpinning of it.
Absolutely.
One thing also as part of the athlete cognition, you mentioned is mental flexibility. So that kind of sounds like a cool term. What does that mean exactly?
So mental flexibility is all about being able to go back and forth between differing instructions quickly and usually subconsciously, right? So for example, in hockey, we might have the puck. Okay, we're on offense. We're entering the zone. What's my job when we have the puck, when we're on offense? Oh, we lost the puck. Now we're on defense. What's my job now? oh, I got to get back to my zone and get to my position and maybe communicate with my teammates. We're in the defensive zone now. Oh, we got the puck. We're breaking out again now. So things change really quickly, right? So there's these differing sets of instructions that our coaches have given to us probably, or that we've learned just by playing the sport over many years. And being able to go back and forth quickly has to do with mental flexibility. And it's really important in sports like hockey, volleyball, basketball, lacrosse, rugby, soccer, football, like these large area, very dynamic team sports where the environment's constantly changing. Your job as an athlete, as a teammate, changes. It could change 10 times on a shift in hockey, so being able to understand these instructions and go back and forth quickly is and again, we start to talk about anticipation and things. So that to me is what mental flexibility is all about. And it also doesn't leave much room for emotion. So I know in hockey, I can tell some maybe funny stories where, players will be on offense, and maybe basketball and soccer, same thing. They'll be on offense, they'll have tons of energy, they'll have maybe a scoring chance, and maybe they'll turn the puck over, turn the ball over, and suddenly they slouch their shoulders, their body language changes. What a turnover. And now they have to kind of get back to their defensive zone. So it kind of removes that emotion and says, okay, we turn the puck over. Like any one set of instructions is not more important than the other. Obviously everybody likes scoring goals and being
Hmm.
offensive and things like that. But being able to shift really quickly without that emotional connection, I think is important as well.
To like seamlessly change mindsets and according to the task that's at hand.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Absolutely.
So how do you work with teams and clients on athlete cognition? Like, how do you put together like programs? Do you work? Is it workshops? How do you work with them on that?
Yeah, so it's been workshops so far. And honestly, just opening the conversation, opening the discussion is the first step. So, you know, I used to ask athletes all the time, what do you need to focus on to play well? And they would typically say, work hard and winning, which are really terrible answers. And I would get those repeatedly. So I thought to myself, okay, if I get bad answers consistently, it's probably a bad question. So now it's more about what information do you need to read to make great decisions?
Hmm.
And then the conversation starts rolling. Oh, well, where the defenseman is, where my partner is, what our team structure, what our team strategy is. Are we playing passive? Are we playing aggressive? That sort of thing. What time of the game, how much time is left, what the score is, all those sorts of things. And now we can make decisions based on that. So just having that discussion is one thing. And then we talk a lot too about the scope of attention. So, you know, novice players or inexperienced players or maybe weaker players have a very narrow scope. Typically, their attention is focused on the puck or the ball in whatever sport, and that's what they see, right? That's what they're processing. Expert players are able to widen that scope of attention and
Hmm.
process the entire field of play. And now they can understand who's open, who's not open, where my partner is, and they can make quicker decisions and better decisions because they're processing more information. So, so we talk about that. I have some slides with, when I work with kids, I talk about a focus flashlight. Imagine playing hockey or soccer in the dark, and the only place you could put your flashlight was on the ball. Could you make good decisions? Well, then they say no. Well, why not? Well, I can't see what anyone else is going on. Okay, well, that's our focus. We want to open that focus
Hmm.
flashlight and shine it on the entire field of play. With older kids and teenagers, I maybe don't use that analogy, but I think understanding that scope of attention is really is another thing that we touch on. We talk about pattern recognition. You know, as I've talked about, there are sports that seem to be very dynamic, very free flowing, very chaotic, but there's patterns in every sport. So what patterns happen in hockey? Let's say, well, breakouts, D zone coverage, 2-on-1s, 3-on-2s, neutral zone regroups. Maybe in soccer, same thing. There's certain patterns that occur, and again, elite players recognize those patterns more quickly and more effectively. Where if I were to watch a football game, I watch the ball. I'm a fan. I've never
Hmm.
played football, never coached football. I watch the ball. Do I really see everyone's job and recognize the pattern of the run play or the pattern of the wide receiver? I don't process that. It's not in my expertise. It's not in my experience. So a football coach or football player would obviously see a lot more things as they watch a play, right? So we talk about pattern recognition quite a bit. We talk about creativity and deception. In a lot of sports, it's all about time and space, right? How do we create time and space for ourselves? How do we create time and space for our teammates? And how do we decrease time and space for the opposition? So we talk about, how do you create time and space? It's deception. How can you deceive someone, fake left and go right, to break it down simply? But how do you use your body? How do you use your eyes? How do you use your head, your hips, your shoulders, your toes, everything to create deception? And we talk about adding up half seconds. You might get a half second of extra time, not even a tenth of a second, but you add those up over the game, it starts to make a big difference, right? So yeah, it's workshop based. It's very again, I'm kind of at the infancy of these programs, so it's very interactive, and I'm learning from the athletes as well, and kind of like iterative all the time, and it's very fluid. But yeah, it's pattern recognition, it's scope of attention, it's relevant cues, it's creativity and deception.
Hmm. And from your experience, have you noticed that maybe because you mentioned the first part is kind of just like getting conversations started with teams on stuff like that. Um, I've noticed this from my experience. I'm wondering if you have too. Is when people look at decision making or hockey IQ, we call it hockey sense or whatever, as like these fixed skills that a player can either have or he doesn't have, and that's it. It
Yeah,
can't
it
be
drives
developed.
drives drives me
Have you
nuts.
noticed that too? Yeah.
I have. I I've heard for 10 years of coaching, oh, this is he's a dumb player. He's not a very smart player.
Hmm.
$1 million legs, 10-cent brain, I've heard, stuff like that.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think we're assessing the wrong things. We might see a mistake or a lack of recognition or a poor decision, and we chalk it up to this player is not very smart, versus what were they perceiving, where was their vision, how did we teach them what we wanted to teach them? Everybody learns differently. What are we not giving them that they need? you know so when players, I've heard, oh, he can't be a point guard, he doesn't see the court well enough, he can't be a center, he's a winger, he's up and down. Um, and it drives me crazy. It's just a fixed mindset. Um, and when coaches put it on players, I think it's doing them a terrible disservice. That you're literally putting limits on them, which is the opposite, I think, of what a lot of coaches want to do. Right? We want to
Hmm.
build their potential and help them grow to even un, unfathomable levels. Really, that's the plan. So when we say things like he's a dumb player or she can't read the game, you know, this is where I think athlete cognition and scope of attention and cues and things like that can, like, honestly, like, change the way coaching happens, man. Like, I
Hmm.
really believe it. Again, I'm in the infancy of it. I hope I can help make a difference somewhere, but that's kind of what the long-term goal is, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it sounds like a great program and something that's really needed in sports. And I don't have a lot of experience in other sports when it comes to um, how coaches view athlete skills, stuff like that. But I know in hockey, I think it does need it for sure, and I think that's
Absolutely.
the great place to start. So with all the programs that you have going on, the athlete cognition, flow state, the consultancy, where can people find you? Where can any social media, website? How can people reach you?
Sure. So our company is called Emergent, and the website is workwithemergent.com. My email is matt@workwithemergent.com. And on LinkedIn, it's just Emergent. You can find us. We like to post some articles and some posts here and there. And on Instagram, it's Work with Emergent. So it's kind of the tagline, I guess. The email, the website, the Instagram, Work with Emergent. So reach out to me anytime through any of those outlets, and I'm happy to chat. I'm happy to share any resources, as I did with you. I'm definitely not one to say, oh, I came up with this, so
Yeah.
no. It's like we want to advance the game. We want to help people learn. So I'm happy to share any ideas and have conversations anytime.